Think of someone you genuinely dislike. Not someone who hurt you, but someone whose very presence feels wrong. Hold that feeling for a moment. Notice how specific it is, not vague annoyance. Something sharper, almost personal. Jung spent 40 years asking one question about that feeling. What if the problem is not the other person at all? Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who founded analytical psychology, developed one of the most uncomfortable ideas in the history of psychology. Jung proposed that every human psyche contains a shadow, a structure in the unconscious that holds everything the conscious personality refuses to identify with. The shadow is not a metaphor for evil. Jung was precise about this. The shadow holds whatever does not fit the identity the ego has chosen, including qualities that are not dark at all. Jung wrote in Aion that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, not a flaw to be fixed, a challenge to be met. The traits that end up in the shadow are not necessarily the worst parts of a person. Sometimes they are the best. A person who was raised to be serious and responsible may have pushed creativity and playfulness into the shadow. A person whose identity was built around selflessness may have buried ambition, anger, and personal desire deep in the unconscious. Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's closest collaborators, described this as gold in the shadow, drawn from her work in projection and recollection in Jungian psychology. The material that was exiled is not just darkness, it is also unlived potential. So the shadow is not simply your bad side, the shadow is everything your chosen identity left behind. Now, here is where Jung's thinking becomes genuinely strange and genuinely useful. Jung proposed that the shadow does not stay quietly inside. When the ego refuses to acknowledge disowned material, the psyche projects that material outward. Projection is the mechanism the shadow finds a hook. Someone in the external world who resembles, even slightly, the disowned material inside. Once a hook is found, the psyche does something remarkable. It takes its own interior content and places it onto another person. The irritation, the inexplicable dislike, the disproportionate reaction, though, those are not responses to the other person. They are responses to the part of yourself they triggered. Jung put it plainly in 2 essays on analytical psychology. Everything that is unconscious in ourselves we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. The form of shadow projection has changed. The mechanisms have not. Jung saw this clearly in 1918, and the observation has only sharpened with time. We no longer subject him to the test of drinking poison. We do not burn him or put the screws on him, but we injure him by means of moral verdicts pronounced with the deepest conviction. C.G. Jung, Civilization in Transition, CW 10, E or 131. The trial by poison is gone. The pile-on has replaced it, and the psychology driving both is identical. Here is the part most people miss. Projection does not require genuine similarity. The psyche needs only the smallest signal. A gesture, a tone of voice, a way of carrying confidence, to hang an entire psychological structure onto another person. This is why the intensity of a dislike rarely matches what the other person actually did. The intensity belongs to the shadow, not to the situation. Think about the colleagues who get under the skin most consistently, not the ones who make mistakes, the ones whose particular quality grates in a way that is hard to explain rationally. The colleague who monitors everyone else's work ethic with the sharpest eye is not always the most industrious person in the room. Jung's model would predict the opposite. The person most vigilant about others' laziness is often the one carrying an unacknowledged fear of their own. The driver who erupts at someone else's recklessness rarely pauses to ask what that eruption reveals about themselves. Consistent with Jung's framework, the intensity of the reaction is the signal. Not evidence of the other driver's fault, but a marker of something unowned in the person reacting. Jung's clinical observation, documented across decades of casework at Bergholzli Hospital, was that these reactions function as diagnostic instruments. The more disproportionate the reaction, the more reliably the shadow is involved. Now comes the counterintuitive twist. The shadow projection mechanism does not only operate in dislike, it operates equally in admiration. In intimate relationships, the accusation most frequently repeated, "You are emotionally unavailable," is worth examining from a Jungian angle. The person who returns to that complaint most urgently may be projecting a disowned need for distance, not simply reporting the other person's behavior accurately. Think of the person who follows a particular artist or public figure with an intensity that feels almost painful. Von Franz's concept of the golden shadow describes this precisely, that admiration shading into longing is often the psyche recognizing, in someone else, qualities it has refused to claim as its own. The admiration that shades into inexplicable emotion, the person whose confidence provokes something close to grief, that is the golden shadow speaking. Jung's insight here is structurally identical, whether the reaction is dislike or worship. Extreme emotional charge directed at another person almost always signals unowned material. This is the insight most versions of shadow work in popular psychology get completely wrong. Pop psychology presents the shadow as a container of shame and failure, things to be confessed, processed, and released. Jung's actual model is colder, more precise, and far more useful. The shadow is compensatory. It holds the balance to the conscious personality. For a person built around rationality, the shadow holds feeling, instinct, and play. For a person built around accommodation, the shadow holds anger and the capacity to refuse. The shadow is not the enemy of the self. The shadow is the full accounting of the self, everything the ego chose not to include in its resume. And here is the practical consequence. Every person who provokes a disproportionate reaction is offering a piece of that accounting for free without asking for anything. The question Jung's psychology asks in those moments is not, why is that person so irritating? The question is, what am I looking at that belongs to me? That shift from judgment to inquiry is what Jung called the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming a whole person rather than a managed one. Individuation is not a destination. Jung never described it as arriving at a finished self. Individuation is the ongoing process of reclaiming projected material and integrating what was exiled back into consciousness. Every shadow projection that is recognized and withdrawn makes the person slightly more whole and makes the other person slightly more visible as an actual human being rather than a mirror. Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The shadow does not disappear by being confronted, but it loses its autonomy. It stops acting through the person invisibly and begins instead to inform them. This is not a comfortable process. Jung was explicit that becoming conscious of the shadow requires considerable moral effort. The discomfort is not accidental. The shadow holds material the ego excluded for reasons, usually because owning that material would require changing something. The question worth sitting with after watching this, the one Jung's psychology keeps returning to, is not, who triggers me? The question is, what would it mean to own what I see in them? If that question landed somewhere uncomfortable or recognizable, leave it in the comments. The most specific observations are the most honest ones. And if this way of looking at the mind is useful to you, subscribe to Numinous Mind. Every video goes further in, and none of them ask for more than your attention.